Welcome to Portals of Perception and to decoding emerging patterns of transformation with Society 2045. 2 years ago, we published a conversation we called Imagine 2045. Today, we are building on that conversation with Leal as we seek to understand and appreciate 8 transformational patterns that you have decoded. Jose, welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure seeing you again, a pleasure being back.
So before we dive into those patterns, those emerging patterns, can you offer the context in which they emerged?
Well, as we spoke about when we talked about Society 2045 back around 2020, 2021, a number of us that are working in different movements across the United States and around the world started to think about how are these movements actually similar, even though they're dealing with completely different domains, right? Because we would have conversations and I would sense, wait a minute, that's kind of the same thing we're doing. But if you were to look at it from the outside, you'd say, well, you're doing this thing in legal and we're doing this thing in work, and they're not the same. Because practically, they're not the same. But pattern-wise, there's a similarity in what's happening underneath these practical happenings. So we started to do these interviews to kind of understand what are people doing and can we harvest some of these patterns. And it took us, interestingly enough, years after the series ended to capture those patterns because we were struggling with different people identifying different patterns. And some people saying, I don't see the patterns that you're seeing. Is that?
Yeah. Can you name some of the movements so we have even the broader sense of the spaces you were looking at? Because it strikes me that you're describing movements of social change or economic change or some other change in some other of the core domains of life. And what you were essentially looking to decode was some kind of a unifying operating system, a source code that's applicable in those different spaces.
Yeah, so I think there's 2 things there. One, what is the source of these patterns? And I think that's a topic that we should really dig deep into because I think that's a really compelling insight that came from this. As far as the different movements, they're in the legal space. They're in with integrative law, for example. They're in the workspace. Organizations that are changing the way we do work. Simcoe style as an example. Radical is another example. The way we do financing and accounting and all of that kind of stuff in some of the movements as well. Sociocracy as another way of collaborating. So it's a large number of different, some movements, some individuals doing work in that space that aren't necessarily movements, but they represent people that are doing that type of work in those domains.
Well, so right there is an insight that we will actually touch in one of the patterns, because what you're describing, which has certainly been something that we have observed also in other spaces in the portals, conversations and explorations, which is that there are broadly distributed endeavors in many different domains. And time and again, people are stumbling on certain core principles of what will enable this change. And this is why it is so compelling to step back and decode and identify what are those patterns.
I would frame that a little different.
Please.
I don't know that people are stumbling on these principles.
Okay.
I think that nature is built with these principles, and people, when given the time to not be regulated by the systems that we live in to the point where they don't allow for them to emerge, that when given that time for them to emerge, they consistently emerge across different domains. That's the insight that came out from this work.
Which is a beautiful segue to the first pattern that you codified as the shift from rigid systems to organic rhythms of life. So in other words, you are already giving us the end at the beginning, which is, I suppose you're proposing that those patterns, they emerge in the organic rhythms of life. But say a little more about how this pattern came alive for you and the various expressions that you focused on.
Well, so what we noticed was that everybody was describing the work that they were doing as a softening of rigid systems. It's like, well, we have these contracts and we don't want these contracts to be so rigid and so formal and so static. So, okay, well, we want them to be flexible in how we create them. We want them to be fluid in their ability to adapt to the environment of the relationship that they are defining. And so that, conscious contracts is an example of that. And the same thing in the sociocracy work. We're dealing with human beings, and rather than having systems that dictate how the thing should happen and maintain control over those aspects of behavior, we actually anticipate that it's going to be a fluid environment. And so these aren't exactly in order, but this was the most common of the patterns that was consistent in almost every single interview we had.
Indeed. So I'm curious, is there an insight? I'll ask the question in two ways and see which of them is more compelling to respond to. One way to frame the question is, what is holding us back from more fully liberating into a way of being and doing and working that is rooted in organic rhythms of life? That's one way to ask the question. And the reverse way of asking the same question is, what are we finding, what are you finding about the circumstances where there is greater capacity or greater liberation indeed into that sense of the organic rhythms of life, sometime in large systems, in large organizations? What enables, what facilitates that?
Time is the first thing. It was interesting that every person we interviewed, some way, shape, or form, had given themselves time to be with the challenges that they were trying to address. And in so doing, created a community and an understanding of what needed to be done, and to develop those ideas into something. The second was that they were removed from the day-to-day system demands. So most of these individuals were not working 24/7 jobs, and were removed from those environments. Again, the vast majority of them, by choice.
So I hear three things there. First, time, and the wisdom implicit in that is, especially when we don't have time, we must take and make time. And then it's just so beautiful because what you said, to be with the problem, the whole orientation in that is, I'm not trying to solve the problem. I allow myself to be with the problem or with the challenge, such that there is, as it is framed in this pivot, in this pattern, such that the organic rhythms of life may suggest themselves to that. And the third thing you said, this becomes more readily available and accessible for people who do not work in the system. They're somewhat detached or outside the system, so they can work on the system from outside the system, thereby free the system to liberate the kind of the life that's held back in the system. Essentially, when you say from rigid systems to organic rhythms of life, what I also hear is let the latent life potential in whatever system we're looking at be released from the arresting prison that the bureaucratical system imposed on it.
You said it so much more beautifully than I did, so thank you for that. Can I interview you?
Thank you. And I appreciate so much that you identified immediately time, because some of what we see with rigid systems, they're frozen in time. It's different, I'm using the word time here in a different context. Yeah. They are frozen in time, and we need time to defrost or to allow that to melt such that life can access or be released in the system.
I'm not sure, again, I would reframe that a little bit differently. It's not so much about thawing out the static systems that have pre-existed, because the thawing out of those systems will likely not happen very quickly. But it is creating new environments and new systems that are bound to the rhythms of life, that attract those who are frozen in time to the freedom of those new environments. And that the staticness of some of those things will remain with us for a very long time. And for some people, it will remain with them for the rest of their lives. But it is about offering others the opportunity to see that comfort of having that time and that fluidity of life.
There is, I can see now, an organic, integrated, connected wisdom in the way these relate to each other, because what you just spoke to now leads to the second pattern, naturally, which you decoded as the shift from linear story progression to the intricate web of nature. And where I saw the link is when you said, no, it's not that those systems need to thaw. There are new patterns, new rhythms that will emerge, and they will do the work on what needs to be released or what needs to be healed. And right there, you are describing a non-linear story.
Exactly.
So what are some of the examples that brought to life this idea of from linear story progression to the intricate web of nature?
The ideas that what we can do is dictate with, say, for example, strategy. Right. So we have a 5-year strategy. We're going to build our 5-year strategy. We tell that story of how our 5-year strategy is going to be. And then we tell everybody, go enact that 5-year story. So that's a good example. Another example, back to law. Here's our agreement. our agreement is going to live this long. You're going to do this, and everybody's going to do these behaviors during this agreement. And everybody will hold up their end of the bargain no matter what, because we agree today that that's what we're going to do. And that's a linear definition of what's about to happen, right? And it presupposes so many things. Nature and its complexity is still happening. We are nature. And those patterns, be it in our organizations or in our agreements or in the way we do finance or the way we do collaboration, all of those things actually operate at some level at the nature level, in those rhythms that is life. And nature's complexity and those linear, we're abutting against those two every day. And so recognizing that when we look at, say, for example, something that we would call a strategy for a period of time, and saying, let's look at where we want to go, but adapt to the flow, the non-linear flow of how we're going to get there. And recognizing that that's a fluid thing that we do, not a linear story that we can tell and be beholden to the story, no matter what the reality is in the moment.
Indeed. Well, this this resonates very much, as you may be aware. A core element of my consulting practice is the working. It is strategy, but I say that I reframed the practice of strategy into the three horizons modality, which in many ways is more than three horizons. It's the idea of successive horizons, where we give ourselves, as you described, the permission to imagine where we want to be 5 or 7 or 10 years from now. The context depends. And then we work backward from that to Horizon 2. And what is Horizon 2? Horizon 2 is the forever adapting, prototyping story that's emergent, where there is forever an input from both ends, from the future that we continue to explore and from current conditions. And then there is the natural healthy tension, where sometimes Horizon 2 tends to collapse into what I call the gravitational pull of Horizon 0, which is where we live by the tyranny of the crisis of the moment, and then we lose the capacity to be more transformational and explorative, which is what we do in the Horizon 2 plus as we lean into Horizon 3. So that's right there. There is it sounds like I'm using linear time, but I'm not. We're not using linear time. We actually use successive calibrations. And the other curious awareness that comes alive for me is there was a particular time in Hollywood, and I traced that somewhere the end of the 70s, early 80s, where script writing transitioned from chronological storytelling. Like if you go back to some of the very old movies, the 10 Commandments, they are told in a chronological way. And by the way, there is an intermission in few places. But at some point, somebody in Hollywood said, let's do the murder in the first 10 seconds and let's unfold the rest of the movie in different sequences of time and build different characters and let the people watching the movie do the puzzling. But it strikes me, given your emphasis here about the idea of the intricate web of nature, this is more the way life occurs.
That the complexity of nature itself and its intricacy is so interdependent that there is no way to make a linear projection of what the future will be. And we do that when we create organizations. We say, we're going to create an organization. We want this organization to last forever, right? And we want it to last forever because why not? We can tell the story. It will last forever. When in reality, that organization is bound to those individuals. It's bound to the work that they do. It's bound to the customers that they serve. It's not a decision of the organization whether it lasts. It's a role that it plays within that context of nature as a whole.
Which, again, nature, when I walk into the forest here, right outside the window, if I look down on the floor of the forest, I would be thinking the forest is dying because I see the rotten branches and the dead leaves. But when I look up, I see the forest is rebirthing itself. So the truth of the matter is the forest is doing both. It's both dying and rebirthing itself. And your invitation in this pattern is, well, can we recognize that in all the living systems we humans create and engage in, we need to allow for those different cycles and different dimensions to co-emerge, co-appear at the same time.
Absolutely. I love your metaphor, or not your metaphor, but you're pointing to the floor of the forest, because when we see decay, we've told ourselves a story that decay is a bad thing, when decay is the source of the next life. And without decay, there is no next life.
So there is underlying, implicit in these realizations, some reframing of belief systems, such as what is it we believe the case to be about decay, about dying? Do we believe it's the end of everything, or do we believe it is simply how the system reboots or regenerates or rejuvenates itself?
Cycles, yeah.
And that leads us to the third pattern, which you decoded as from transactions to relationships, or from impersonality of transactions to depth of relationships. There is an importance here of the word depth. Say something about the significance of that depth and relationships in this pattern.
What we kept seeing was, with the interviews, this very interesting thing. People would say, well, we used to do this thing, and it was, this very transactional thing, whatever it was. And what we realized was that when we did that transactional thing, no one really believed it. No one liked it. No one supported it. No one, say again, back to the contracts. Contracts are a perfect example. We have parties that come to it from these linear stories. They build these contracts through their lawyers. They hardly actually communicate to each other, other than on the day of the signing, right? It's like, oh yeah, we'll sign. Very likely didn't even read the details of the whole thing, but signed it anyway because their lawyer said, yeah, it's good for you to sign. And so they don't have a relationship with the other party, and don't have a relationship with the very document that represents their relationship. They don't even have a relationship with the document, much less the other individual. And what we see is that those types of transactional instruments end up actually representing a fracture in relationships rather than a binding in relationships. That there is no relationship because the document pretends that there is, and therefore allows for this non-relationship relationship to exist. It is the very document that actually creates that power for not having a relationship.
Well, so it reflects on the idea that before we have had legal documents, we made agreements by shaking each other's hand, which esoterically meant we are leveling the energetic intent in the hands that we shake. So what this says is, if I extrapolate it, it offers an insight into why so many relationships are broken. Because in the first place, when they are cemented by some kind of a legal transaction, you're saying that is the very antithetical element or artifact of what organic relationship can be. And also when it is approached through a linear, I mean, there are no linear relationship. Perhaps that's one of the reasons why a lot of marriages are broken, because people think that what they agreed to in their 20s or 30s will last exactly in the same way, where perhaps the most important agreement in any relationship, intimate relationship, ought to be, well, let's embark on a learning journey. We're going to learn about each other. We're going to learn about ourselves. We're going to learn about how relationships will evolve for us. And if we can embrace this journey as a learning journey, that's probably more powerful than any certificate that we will create anywhere.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And what we saw is that pattern happening across the board again, where people were focusing with this new pattern on how do we support these transactions with a relation first approach. We need these transactions. That's how our world works. But let's make them relational agreements, relational contracts, relational organizations, relational approaches to finance. Let's do those, because that changes so that we are connected to each other again.
So in those examples, you're describing specifically a movement within the practice of law where the relational dimension and the integrational approach are central, and the proficiency of legal documents becomes an add-on rather than the first principle.
Yeah.
The fourth pattern you describe as the shift from exclusivity of proprietary to inclusivity of commons. So again, like most of the patterns, they have two dimensions in there. What captures my attention here, which is curious, is so there is from exclusivity to inclusivity. I could also say that from isolation to integration, similar idea. And then there is this idea of the proprietary and the commons. Describe how those emerged for you in those explorations.
So much of the work that we saw when people were saying we want to see transparency in information. So what is transparency information? Well, transparency information is that someone isn't hoarding information. And the reason that they hoard it is because they say it's my information. I'm the CEO, I have this information. We're the C-suite, we have this information. I'm the, and so on, right? And so what was observed as transparency and discussed in many of the conversations about the ability to have both transparency and to have ownership of things, led to this idea that what we were observing is the letting go of ownership as an individualistic endeavor, that I own this information because my role dictates that I have the power to own this information, when in reality, the information belongs to the organization, as an example, or to society, as an example. And so the idea of the commons is not so much of a new thing emerging, but that the concept of ownership melts away and it becomes transparent and distributed and not centralized. That was very consistent throughout.
So you're really describing their readiness to surrender control points. So much of the transactions of a capitalist system is that you control something that gives you an advantage. And not only that, in the work we do in innovation spaces, people often say, well, so we're only going to invest that kind of capital in building that innovation if we can protect that differentiation by creating a moat that will not be easy to copy and emulate. So how do you place that, and or are you saying, well, we're really seeing in this pattern something that is challenging the foundation of the capitalist system, or perhaps will give rise to a new corrective remedial process within is giving rise to remedial vectors within the capitalist system?
So I think there's two answers to that. I think the first answer is that the way that we've evolved as a society has been that in some ways we've been much more communal in the past. And in some ways we've actually been much more exclusive in the past. That single individuals had actually much more power than they do today. Kings, emperors, lords, all had much more power because it was exclusive power. They could dictate exactly what they wanted. Most people today don't have that level of power. But what we see is that what's evolved is that we've broadened the scope of power for individuals. So in the United States, as an example, the president doesn't have full power, right? We've taken some and put it in the Congress, put some in the judiciary, and that power is distributed, and there's a balancing act. It so happens that in many of the way that we do business, live our day-to-day lives, there are still individuals with absolute power. Mm-hmm. And we say, well, he's the boss, he gets to decide. He's the CEO, he gets to decide. We don't have the same level of balancing. So the idea that seems to be happening is that the moat is moving not from around the person, but to the organization and into sectors and communities of organizations, where we see that the organization sees the benefits of working with another group of organizations and sharing, collectively sharing that information and that ability to work together, not as an isolationist, but as a commons, but it doesn't mean we obliterate the moat. It's just that the moat is moving further out, away from individuals and away from single organizations to groups of organizations and networks of organizations.
There are many CEOs that will readily admit that they don't feel at all that they have ultimate power, and that in fact they are governed by the markets, number one, and by public opinion, number two. So we do have now increasingly an inverted pyramid where the power has been distributed, and there we are sometimes struggling with the way power is exercised by small cross sections or interest groups or minorities that take the right to exercise power or noisy power in a way that is not truly promoting the sense of a equally distributed or a fairly distributed commons.
I would agree with that. I think that your, say, for example, ahead of Google, the market is saying you need to shrink, you need to become more efficient, you need to figure out a solution to the problem of AI, because search is going to be a huge problem with the coming of the AI. The pressure is there. The market is affecting him and dictating that he needs to shrink. But he's the one that makes the decision of who he's going to shrink, what departments he's going to cut, what individuals are going to be let go. And so that power is not distributed.
Indeed.
That is a moat around that individual. He has that power. Now you can say, well, he counts on his VPs and so forth to get to do some of that work. But ultimately, he's the one that says we need to drop 10% of our staff. And, I want these activities to cease, which he's done recently in the last couple of weeks.
The fifth pattern you describe is the shift from separation of self and other to realization of interdependence. So what brought this shift from separation to interdependence to life in your explorations?
One of the people that we interviewed that stood out on this one was Sharif Abdullah, and his understanding and the use of the word consciousness, collective consciousness, where looking at traditional societies, there was an understanding of that forest floor as being what it is, that disturbing that broke the cycle. And recognizing that we are interdependent as individuals, as life itself, changes our understanding of what it is that we're doing to and for each other. And the pattern that emerged speaks to something that is something we're working on in a forthcoming book, Serving Life, that life seeks to serve life not as an option, not as a choice, but as the very process of life is to serve life. And when we fractured that by creating this idea of independence, the idea of self-made, the idea of I'm the individual who did these things, that we're in that very moment actually fracturing the reality, which is that any one individual cannot exist independent of the rest of nature. And and so seeing that interdependence as a process, not only of how we see the world, but how we can work within the world. And that was exemplified more so by Sharif than anyone else. But consistently, the pattern showed up when you look at what is it that folks are doing in their respective work. And more often than not, the idea that what we were looking for is ways to bring together rather than separate, to bring together people, to bring together systems, to bring together processes, rather than fracturing them, rather than pulling them apart.
So again, the suggestion is that this way, this pattern, this source code is naturally emergent in living system. And so we humans can either be conscious or led even unconsciously into there is the curious conundrum of leadership in many of these patterns, which is, so do you need somebody to consciously say, this is something I realize about myself as an individual. I am actually part of a connected system. I'm not an independent person. Therefore, I will conduct business in this way. Therefore, I will lead in this way. How did you integrate leadership into this exploration?
It was interesting. Leadership is probably where we would see the most divergence in the interviews. Divergence in the sense that it seems to be a very compelling desire for people that there be leadership, that there be individuals who play a role of leading. And yet it seems to go contrary to the very patterns that they're describing of what they're doing, which is to place leadership within a relationship with others rather than in opposition to others. And the role of leadership as being a part of collective process of individuals playing their role in leading in different ways and leading at different times and leading in different domains, but not being a leader per se. In other words, that the leading is an activity that we all do, rather than the leader is an individual who takes on the role of leader at all times in all ways. And so it's less about placing someone on a pedestal and more about leadership being a consistent way for people to step up and bring their strengths to an environment that they're participating in.
You're describing a way in which leadership has been liberated from the construct of identifying with a person and is rather viewed as a function and or a capacity and or an activity. And so any system in the different domains, there will be different people stepping up to that activity, to that function, to that capacity, somewhat like we see in nature, again, going back to nature. So in birds' migration, when they change direction, you would always have different birds in the front. There is no, in that sense, leadership is being at the front, and a second or a minute later, some other bird will be in the front. Can we humans emulate that kind of an intelligent conduct?
I'm going to reframe that a little different again, because again, we are nature. What we've learned is that the story that there are people who are naturally born leaders and that those people have the right, sometimes inborn, sometimes God-given, sometimes whatever, right to impose their will on others as leaders. That story of what a leader is what has debased leadership from the natural process that we do. I love the example of a natural emergency.
Mm-hmm.
Not obviously that the emergency happens, but the example of what people do in those things. We hear it all the time. My neighbor helped me. They came over, they saved me. They got, they found themselves a boat, they saved us, we were flooded, and so on and so forth. People take leadership role in environments where the patterns don't exist.
Right.
Where the systemic patterns don't exist, that are rigid, that keep them from doing it.
You describe the 6 emergent pattern as the shift from limitations of centralized structures, we're just talking about it in the context of leadership, to freedom of distributed systems. So again, it describes the shift from limitation to freedom, which is attractive, and from a centralized structure to a distributed ecosystem. Any other example that appeared in your exploration that you'll highlight in this context?
Yeah, and so this one is again, like number one, almost everybody spoke to this pattern. In the case of both legal and work, it was very, very, very prevalent. And the idea that we have a system of organization that builds from a hierarchical perspective and a society that builds from a hierarchical perspective has consistently been seen as by these patterns, these individuals who are doing these patterns, been seen as a low-hanging fruit. It's sort of like the thing that we want to address. What I found, though, is that the pattern itself is less about decentralizing
Mm-hmm.
and more about ecosystem.
Mm-hmm.
It's the generation of ecosystems that provide the flows necessary for decentralization not to be required.
So this one is very curious because we can identify several spaces where, well, let's for example take platform technologies such as YouTube. This is going to be on YouTube. Okay, so and any other social media. So that distributed a certain capability, and we found ourselves in a communication ecosystem where instead of like half a century ago there were 3 channels in the United States, now everybody can have their channels. So that's one side of the equation. The criticism that can be brought to that story is that, well, but the platform technology is owned by one monopolistic company that gets to build their logic and prioritization into the algorithm, and that their algorithmic choices are not necessarily tailored to life principles, but rather to drive addictive behaviors that are most aligned with their business model. So there, perhaps one way I am reconciling this is that any of the pattern you describe, the anti-pattern or the polarity, is always co-arising in some way or shape or form. I'm curious, how would you talk through this?
I would say that making the assumption, and I think it's a fairly, personally, I feel that it's a fairly safe assumption that these patterns are not patterns we've discovered. They're not patterns that the folks who have demonstrated them created. They're emergent from nature itself. And that would lead me to believe that nature seeks to have these patterns extend themselves. So we see that going from 3 television networks where someone controlled very tightly what happened on that network, to the fact that you and I and anybody on earth can actually post a video on YouTube now. And no one regulates, for the greater part, of course, within reason, that we can or cannot put our opinions on there, right? And so that in itself is this pattern happening.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, what allowed for that technology to happen was this ability for an organization to become more centralized in itself and to have to be one of the top 10 organizations in the world. And that type of dichotomy between what's happening at one level and what's happening at another level is what you've just described. It is not the first time. The robber barons of a century ago were doing the same thing. People who could not move outside of their geographical area because there was no transportation were all of a sudden found themselves able to board a train and be on the other side of the country for the first time in history. But with that came the consolidation of wealth and power in the robber barons that created those train companies. So it's not that it goes straight. Again, it is the complexity of nature itself. And in order for some of these patterns to extend themselves out, they give up that ability to do it in some other aspect that relates to that pattern.
So we are truly sensing through these patterns into the source code of life, the source code of nature. And one way to describe the currency of life is power. I can move my hand because there is power that enables me to move my arm and speak these words. And what we are now describing in this sense, from limitation of centralized structures to freedom of distributed ecosystems, we are really describing how power is managed in systems and whether power is centralized or whether power is distributed. And we're seeing that at different levels of the ecosystem, it goes through different ebbs and flows. Your insight is nature loves the proliferation, the distribution within an ecosystem, and in the large scale of time, it moves in that direction, even if periodically for certain cycles there has had to be a consolidated structure that enabled as a tool to distribute the power to the many.
More widely, yes.
Yeah, fascinating. So that leads us to the 7th pattern, which you codified as the pivot from projection of career to dance of purpose. So this for me is a given. I've in a way never had a career. I actually told myself consciously, very early in my life when I left the Air Force, that I was going to be on a purpose discovery journey. And it was that became the catalyst, I'd say this way, a thriving, lucrative consulting practice was not a planned projection, it was more a byproduct that for me came out of the search for purpose. What was curious for me very much when I read this, said, how did you mean dance of purpose? So that shift from a projection, I saw there again from linear to intricate, but what else would you describe about dance and how and why you used this word to describe this pattern?
Because we replace in a lot of conversations about purpose, we replace this projection of what I will be as a career or what I will be as an accomplishment of my life to this projection of my purpose is X. Purpose, as evidenced by many of the speakers, including myself, because that is an area of expertise for me, is not a projection or a destination, but an understanding that I have certain level of capacity for certain things, that I react in certain ways in certain environments with certain folks, and that if I lean into that, then I'm dancing with that purpose, that I'm engaging the very faculties that are mine with the understanding that they exist in me, and that the purpose that I have is to engage in the way that I can best engage to serve life.
Okay, so I will describe 3 different ways people use, they're going to be simplified versions of how people conjure up in their map of meaning the word purpose and try to see where what you offered is. So one way, especially in Western, especially in American mindset, often people associate with purpose as a prize at the top of the mountain, and you're going to work very hard and you're going to win the gold medal, or you're going to win your Oscar, or you're going to achieve something exterior out of you, and that will be the actualization or the realization of your life purpose. So that's one construct where the purpose is exterior to you.
And very consistent with the career construct.
Indeed. Then there is the construct that says, no, I was born with purpose. And actually going through life is a bit like Michelangelo finding that large piece of rock and said, all I had to do was chisel out to liberate David from outside the rock. And so therefore I will go through life and my experiences and my ups and downs and struggles. What they do is they reveal to me the purpose that is exhibited by talent and skills that I'm gifted by, all of which are some of the capacities and pathways through which I get to express my purpose. And right next to it, there is a third even way of imagining or integrating purpose, which is an idea that there is the greater purpose of life. And I get to partake in the greater purpose of life by discovering how can I be in service of the various situations that I find myself in. And it is that, the purpose of life itself, that get expressed through my purpose as I am in service of the ecosystems that I find myself in. So the second and the third are not mutually exclusive, but they are differently, in a different way emphasized. Where would you describe?
Differently articulated. Yeah, I would put them I would put the way that we heard purpose pretty much squarely in the middle of 2 and 3.
Okay.
Um, it it is life, but it also is that I have a unique representation of that life, and that it is my conscious understanding of that unique representation that allows my conscious self to be able to bring myself to the place where I need to be at the right time in the right place. And that aspect of purpose, recognizing that there is the thing that is life in me that is unique. That is unique. My representation of life is unique.
Yes, I appreciate that very much. And it resonates deeply with the work we are developing and publishing in portals into the soul, where there is the way we describe it there is that each person is showing up here with a unique configuration. That's why not only do we see unique configuration in your fingerprint and in your eyes, the inner part of your eyes, there is something important. It's a sacred fact, if I can bring the word sacred into this conversation, that you are showing up here as a unique representation of life. It's not just a random thing. There is something about that that is totally significant. And honoring that, said differently, actually we cannot honor fully life without honoring the fact that you and I and each person, we show up here as a unique configuration, never seen before or after in quite the same way, and that is a very important part of the appreciation of life.
Not only that, which I wholly agree with, but there's also the reality that even if you were an exact replica of somebody, a minute ago, the environment that you interact with is different than that person. And so purpose is, again, not distinct, it is an interplay between us and the ecosystem of nature, the rest of the ecosystem of nature, because we are but a node in that ecosystem.
This opens a fascinating tangent, and I will just name it and see if you want to play with that for a bit, and then we'll bring up the eighth pattern, because so there is an anxiety in places all over the planet about this AI revolution that we are in the middle of, and specifically, will it put so many people out of work? There are even there are more cataclysmic or civilizational risking stories about AI. We'll leave these out for a moment, but it begs the question, is there a purpose inside an AI engine or AI model, is there a purpose in a large language model, or would you say no? That purpose is a capitalistic purpose. It's a profit-making engine for a company. Somebody could say that, and so therefore there is a whole range of jobs and opportunities that will never be taken away from you. It's a different question as to whether the economic models will enable you to make a living out of those, but there is something unique about you that can never be taken away or be replicated by an AI model. Where do you place that conundrum?
So I think there's two things. One, that AI isn't artificial. AI is a part of nature because nature built it. And our desire to build AI has been around much longer than these corporations that are doing it today. right? We didn't come up with the idea. It wasn't OpenAI or Google that said, "Oh, let's go create AI," right, out of whole cloth. The idea of AI has been around for centuries. That we could someday build a machine that would be able to do things that are superior to our ability to do certain things. And in many ways, we've done that. We've done that with a computer. Here we are talking to each other, 500 miles apart from one another. And in fact, here we are. This is AI at play. Mm-hmm. Whether we call it that or not, it is. So I think that when we think of it as artificial, we actually separate it from ourselves. We define it as something that is not a part of life, but it is a tool just as any other tool we've built. And every tool we've ever built was with the intention that that tool was going to serve life better than we could do it without that tool.
You're really saying we shouldn't be speaking about AI, we should be speaking about LI, life's intelligence.
There is a reason why life, and I can't speak to why, but there is a reason why life continues to desire a greater and greater set of tools to serve itself. And that tool, as a child, I remember thinking, wow, someday, right? As a child, someday we will have AI.
Well, so inside this idea of a dance of purpose, there is, in what you're now suggesting, a sense, an intuition that life has a teleology, has a purpose, in the sense that it forever aspires to greater sophistication, to greater complexity, to greater capacity, to greater something else.
Exactly. And then when we, again, back to the example of the train, when we say, well, the corporation that made the train was centralization, it was robber barons, they abuse a lot of people in the creation of the trains and all of that stuff. All true. And we are better today at doing things. We don't enslave people in the way that we did during that era. And we will continue to be better about it. But we have to look at the higher pattern and the lower pattern. The lower pattern got us to distribute people across this land in a way that we couldn't do before. Mobility became a thing. And at the same time, it also consolidated and concentrated wealth and power. Same is happening today in this new space. Mm-hmm. We're able to act in ways, do things with the tool of AI that are not dissimilar from our ability to move across a continent in a way that we could not prior to that, right? And that work displaced a lot of horses. It displaced a lot of, right? The car came around and we killed, literally in the United States, we killed millions of horses. Mm. So is that a good thing? It's a bad thing? If we judge, then we judge on the basis of intention. Mm-hmm. If we observe, then we actually look at what manifested, and that in its manifestation, things had to change. And so I think that's where we're at.
Which brings us to the eighth pattern and the pivot from static forecasts of predictive models to fluid adaptability of dynamic realities. And you were just describing a dynamic reality in the story of horses, and you could tell other stories. The point is, can we step back and observe what the pattern is, and then choose, if we want to choose, value judgments in the way we choose to tell a story? That's still, we have the right to do so, but your invitation in these patterns was to step back and actually observe what the case is.
Observe the pattern, not the practice. Because the pattern causes certain practices to emerge, but it's a pattern that, if we look back historically, these patterns have maintained themselves.
What would you highlight with the idea of fluid adaptability, and what are dynamic realities that you observed?
So this one is almost sort of a catch-all to a few others. Mm-hmm. Because the predictive speaks to the story. It speaks to the linear, right? But at the same time, it is bigger. It actually speaks to the models, to the systems. And much of what we've done is we've talked about stories in a small subset. So we talk about a story of how our company is going to work, of how our agreement's going to work, of how we're going to build a strategy, and the strategy is predictive, and so on and so forth. But we've actually created systems mm-hmm. that are embedded with predictability. So it isn't about just our behaviors, but the artifacts themselves that have in of themselves become predictive tools. Mm-hmm. And that their predictability, say, for example, our economic system, right? The whole of our economic system is based on this predictable model. And when we see that these predictable models, these systems, are in of themselves have become artifacts that aren't part of a dynamic cycle. They've become abstracted away from the dynamism of our lives, of nature itself. And so there isn't a way to influence them in day-to-day operation. They've become calcified, if you will.
Yes. Well, a curious case in point appears with how supply chain organizations evolved over the last few decades, because they, at a particular point when we thought the world was flat and globalization was here to stay in the early 2000s, more and more supply chain organizations developed this idea of just-in-time supply chain, which was their concept of being highly efficient and not investing too much in anything other than when it's needed. But then they discovered, as a result of that, through the crises that followed, and especially through the latter part of the second decade of the 21st century, that lead up to even before the pandemic, and since with now wars re-emerging in Europe, more and more you see in the supply chain space that they've realized that no, they needed to reclaim certain redundancies. Of course, when we go into nature, we see that nature's resilience integrates tremendous amount of redundancy. When I look at an orange tree, I don't know, it probably produces 10 times or 100 times.
100 times.
100 times more flowers than, so only a very small percentage of the orange blossoms will actually result in a fruit. Most will drop from the tree without fruiting. So this rigid idea of forecast efficiency is not borne by the evidence of nature.
But nature also generated our ability to forecast.
Right.
So it's not about one or the other, but about balance within those environments. So it's not about saying we do not need systems, right? It's just that those systems can't be so rigid, so de facto, this is what we predict, and therefore this is the way it works. And no matter what, we keep doing this. And what we've built is systems in our society that we've placed on them, even though they were created, say, in the case of a government, created 300 years ago, and say, well, that's the way that the government shall work forever. Because 300 years ago, we were so brilliant. When in reality, things have changed. AI, for example, is joining the fray here. How will AI change how we see our government? How will AI see how much more power as an individual we will have, that I can now do things that I needed a team around me 2 years ago to do? Things that I'm now empowered to do. I can create graphics of a caliber that I would never be able to have created 2 years ago, or to write things and have them edited and validated in ways that I wouldn't be able to do. So these things that we're seeing is that the dynamism of nature itself is a consistent, ever-changing and flowing process. And we've decided that certain things can in our society, can become rigid, can become static, and that those things are actually more important than the dynamism of nature.
Once again, you're describing a fear-based, protective, control-driven conduct.
Yes.
Before we leave this and bring some kind of a summation, which you already offered a summation, I'm curious, just staying a little extra moment with AI, would you say AI is a predictive model, or is it a fluid, adaptive model? And the AI we have today, I believe, is governed by the large language model that it was trained on, and in that sense is predictive. It's predictive based on all that it was trained in the learning process. So the inferencing is predictive based on what it was programmed to be able to address. Am I describing that correctly?
You are, and you're also describing me, and you're also describing yourself.
Okay. Right, you're saying that I'm also describing the oak tree in that, and the eagle, and any other creature, because you're saying we are also in the sense of the sum total of what has been the programmability of life itself is expressed through each of those different models. But if you extrapolate that, are you ascribing some living properties like soul or consciousness to the development, the evolution of AI?
So let's move those two words aside for a second, because those two words are fraught with lots and lots and lots of problems. But let's look at the patterns of behavior that human beings and other animals have. I love it when people say generative AI is not really creative, not like us. And I would argue exactly like us, creative, exactly like us, because creation is the ability to put multiple dots together and assemble them in a different pattern. That's what we do as human beings. We have an experience of the world. We assemble these dots in a unique way, unique to us, unique to that AI. And we assemble them and we say, oh, here's a new thing. The way they generate art. It's the mashup of all these dots from previously seen images, brought together in a different, novel way. So I think AI is extraordinarily creative, more so than us. What AI is not is motivated.
Mm-hmm.
And motivation is life itself.
Mm-hmm.
So whether that's consciousness and souls and things of that nature, I can't speak to that. But what I can say is that I'm certain that the very existence of AI is a pattern of life.
Mm-hmm.
And that AI as a tool, that humans have been building tools for millennia, will alter our landscape like every other tool has altered the landscape. Our use of fire, our use of axes, our use of darts, all of which have altered the landscape dramatically. And I think AI has the power to do the same and more. And I think that looking at these patterns lets us understand that we're not here to dictate what happens and doesn't happen. We're here to figure out how to go with the flow of life rather than contradict the flow of life.
And so that possibly is a summation of the 8 patterns. Here is one way I wrote for myself the integration of the 8 patterns. It's an invitation for organic, natural relationships of inclusivity and interdependence in ways that facilitate freedom of purpose and dynamic adaptability. So that's the brief I'm hearing from the 8 patterns, and the sense that they deliver in me is it sounds like a world we can thrive in. Possibly you'd say, I want to reframe this to a world we are thriving in.
I think that we are in many ways thriving, in many ways killing ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
The lack of recognition of these patterns is what is removing our energy from being in the flow of what life needs. We are taking individuals and putting them to work in things that are not actually serving life. And they feel that they're not serving life. They hate their work. They hate the time that they're spending doing these things. And their sense of not being happy, again, we're judgment about what's happening. They're unhappy with their work. No, life is unhappy, wasting life. And when we waste life, that means we don't deal with the things that those individuals were meant to deal with. And when those individuals who were meant to be moving life forward are being hijacked by these systems that are not bound to life, then we're actually creating the crisis that we have today. Because I can work at a job making a product or a service that is harming life and I'm doing it because it's making me money, and I'm not happy about it. But that's okay because I'm making money. And so to me, it's neither one nor the other, it's both. We're doing both, and it's the first aspect of these patterns that is the harm, and the second aspect of these patterns that provides us with the insight to be able to let go and create new ways of doing things that are consistent with these life patterns.
Is there a hope or an intent or an agenda even that by informing, by educating people, by bringing, helping people become aware of those patterns, that even through the transference of the knowledge and the awareness, there is a psychoactivating catalyst that help unlock the energy that facilitates that shift from the static, the arresting, the separating, to the fluid, the interdependent, the integrated?
I think our initial hypothesis stands, which is the best place that we can place our energy is in the people who are doing leadership roles, that are already activated, and helping them see what they're doing, and helping them see where their motivation is coming from, and helping them bring language to the work that they're doing that isn't just about the practical thing, but the relationship with where it emerged from and what is happening. Because that, we think, changes the story and the behavior in these movements towards an alignment with life in a more direct and conscious way. That it isn't just that these things are emerging and we're not aware of them, but they were emerging and we can actually see them because we recognize them for what they are and our ability to negotiate them.
So I'll close perhaps, Jose, with asking, what are your hopes for, say, 10 years from now?
How's about 2045?
2045. What are your hopes for 2045?
My hopes for 2045, and the reason we picked 2045 was because it was 25 years away from when we started. And we thought that 25 years, it seems at the same time long enough, and at the same time very short period of time. I'll tell you a little brief story. I mentioned the car earlier. In 1900, there were 8,000 cars in the United States. In 1925, there were 20 million cars in the United States. And what's remarkable is not that we built 20 million cars in 25 years. What's remarkable is that we taught 20 million people to drive. We built millions of gas stations. We built millions of miles of road. We built signage and directions and maps, things that did not exist in that period of time. Prior to that time, there were hardly any road maps. There were hardly any roads that were car-worthy. So I think we're at that stage in the inflection of society's movements that is not linear. And we're about to be going through that process.
Of building a whole new infrastructure for the society that's emerging.
Correct. A whole new society.
Whole
Because
new-
society changed completely in those 25 years.
Yeah.
And we're in the beginnings of that same cycle. So my hope is that we recognize that that pattern is happening, that cycle is happening. That cycle is these patterns arising, and that what we will see is an opportunity to build new organizations, new legal systems, new governance systems, that will fairly rapidly displace a good part of the current system and operate more closely to these living patterns. We'll never hit it right because we have this beautiful ability to imagine and to dictate and to judge. And we need that balance. But we can't be afraid of striving for being in connection with life rather than dictating what life can and should do.
Thank you for this beautiful and compelling tour. Not only a tour into the future, but a tour through and with those patterns, those living patterns, emergent living patterns from the source code of life, and how they are shaping and transforming our world. And the great thing about it is we're going to be here to watch, participate, and co-create the change that you are describing. Thank you so much.
Thank you. This has been a really marvelous time. I truly appreciate our conversation today. It's enjoyable.
Thank you. Along with our website at portalsofperception.org, Portals is also available on YouTube and on all podcast platforms, as well as social media. You can become an active member and join the conversation in community events. And you can help us get the word out by liking this content and by sharing it with your friends.